Hello, thank you so much for watching. My name is Anna Cutter, and my paper, Democracy, the New Deal, and COVID-19, The Argument for a People's Theater, utilizes archival work, democratic and public goods theory, and American theatrical history to make an argument that the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic is the ideal time to re-implement a federal theater in the United States. The federal theater, why is it doing that? Like, how can I... Oh, okay, we can just click. Great, starting over. Hello, thank you so much for watching. My name is Anna Cutter, and my paper, Democracy, the New Deal, and COVID-19, The Argument for a People's Theater, utilizes archival work, democratic and public goods theory, and American theatrical history to make an argument that the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic is the ideal time to re-implement a federal theater in the United States. The Federal Theater Project was a programmatic subset of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration, designed to stimulate the American economy, provide employment opportunities for arts workers within their fields, and make locally relevant works of theater accessible to rural and low-income communities in the midst of the Great Depression. Although it faced an untimely end, the project proves that a contemporary federally funded theater could serve not only as a touchpoint of relief after the COVID-19 pandemic, but as a crucial way for communities to express, explain, and examine their political relationships. Today, I will begin with a discussion of theater as a public good and potential catalyst for democratic connection. This will be followed by an overview of the history of the Federal Theater Project. And finally, I will conclude with the personal archival material of Hallie Flanagan, the director of the project, focusing on her suggestions for the institution of a permanent federal theater and by explaining how a program structured around her contributions to American democracy could function in the 21st century. The theater has served as a catalyst for democratic connection since its origins. In ancient Athens, theater was a lens through which war, love, and other concepts central to political life were presented and made accessible to citizens regardless of social status or education level. The theater can also be visualized as a public good, a physical institution which communities share. Democracy thrives in a society's mutual investment in the objects, services, and experiences which they have in common. These modalities of the theater as an institution represent a potential for theater to live up to the democratic hallmarks of universal access, egalitarianism, and social connectedness. The current American theater does not live up to this potential. It is not universally accessible because it exists as a wholly capitalistic enterprise. Commercialization and commodification has replaced citizenry. Instead of providing a forum for community members to understand each other's experiences, the only stories which are told are the ones which will sell. Second, it is not egalitarian because marginalized theatrical artists and workers are disproportionately affected by the inequities of the industry, such as unemployment or poor and exploitative working conditions, and as such are not well represented both behind the scenes and in the stories told on stage. This leads me into my third point, which is that the contemporary American theater is not a tool for social connectedness. Limited representation is detrimental to democracy because it leaves us with the answers of those few who are already in control, not by virtue of popular agreement, but because long-standing systems have been set up to benefit them. This is especially true in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, which shuttered the doors of hundreds of community theaters across the United States and added to the theatrical unemployment problem, particularly for workers of color. Assistance from existing relief programs has been insufficient to solve this labor problem and does not address the larger systemic problems plaguing the American theater. Using the opportunity of our recovery from COVID-19 as a flashpoint for structural change, we can reshape the American theater to its original purpose, a shared experience from which members of a democracy can stage and explicate their own relationships. Solutions to these problems do not need to come out of thin air. There's precedent for them in American public policy. The Federal Theater Project led to the creation of socially vital, regionally specific, and historically important works of theater. From 1935 to its termination in 1939, the project employed over 13,000 people, brought low-cost theater to over 30 million audience members, and made locally relevant plays accessible to rural and low-income communities. The FTP lived up to standards of accessibility because it created opportunities for theater in small towns and rural areas across the United States, which had not previously had them. Across the country, ticket fees were kept at rates much lower than the commercial theater or not charged at all. The FTP also placed an egalitarian emphasis on workers' rights and equality for the marginalized. The FTP included units with plays produced and performed entirely with Black casts and crew, and many FTP shows were racially integrated, a rarity at the time. Professional theatrical workers, usually unionized, were hired from relief roles in each FTP city. 90% of all funds allocated to the program were legally required to be used for workers' salaries, and the project was therefore a success for workers' dignity and their rights to do the work which they know and are skilled at. The project was also a tool for community connection. During the 4 years in which it operated, Federal Theater Project productions were well attended and well reviewed in local newspapers. Even when regional productions featured controversial themes, they fostered community discussion and debate about the role of accessible and inclusive political art. The living newspapers, which dramatized the political problems faced by the working class, proposed radically progressive and economically leftist solutions. In New York, plays by Jewish playwrights were performed in both Yiddish and English. Rural communities in the South used FTP stages to condemn the social constructs which upheld racist oppression against Black Americans. Unfortunately, these themes grew to shape a debate over the project's very existence. Hallie Flanagan's insistence that the American people only benefited from challenging theater conflicted with the project's need for federal funding. In June of 1939, as part of an anti-Roosevelt campaign intended on shutting down the WPA entirely, the House Committee on Un-American Activities declared the federal theater project propaganda for communism and immediately cut off all funding. However, if we agree with Hallie Flanagan, who famously responded to this claim by calling the project propaganda for democracy, and agree that a federal theater is the best platform from which to build a democratic one, what would this program look like in the 21st century without the structure of the Works Progress Administration? In April of 1939, anticipating the danger to come, Flanagan was working on a plan to establish a permanent federal theater in the United States. Key points of the plan include her intentions for funding the program, maintaining equitable labor practices, and incorporating theater much more explicitly into local political communities. While much of the archival material of the federal theater itself is available through the Library of Congress, this document remains in Flanagan's personal materials in the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts and was not deemed to be relevant to the overall history of the project. However, I believe that it gives us a new perspective of Flanagan as a democratic theorist and demonstrates the financial and structural feasibility of a federal theater as a permanent venture in American public policy. Flanagan suggested financing the plan via funds earmarked from an admissions tax on live arts and general amusements, which at the time had precedent in dozens of European and South American countries and has since been implemented in hundreds of local governments across the United States. Flanagan invokes public goods theory in expressing her faith that the taxpayers' realization that their money would be going straight to services that they benefited from would make them more willing to pay it. Essentially, that their contributions to the shared public good would make them a better citizen.